Hi, I'm David Watervers. I'm the curator of the gallery at the University of Greenwich, and unfortunately, I'm not able to be with you this time because of visa complications. Be with my colleague Maria, who's also from the University of Greenwich, to come and talk to you about the exhibition of British photography that's on display at Ross Photo at the moment. In any case, I've ended up with a bit of a cold at this time, so more apologies as well because my voice might be a little bit more gravelly and difficult to understand than usual, but sorry about that. The talk I'm going to give, this first of two talks, is about collections, collectors, and archives. I used as a springboard for the talk Walter Benjamin's essay on unpacking his library, but I'm using it to think about the collections that we build up around us in our everyday lives, digital and non-digital, really the kind of clutter that itself becomes a collection, the clutter that we generate around us. In my lecture, I ask how these this personal clutter or these personal archives, as in the end, we can think of them as contribute to a broader archival matrix that speaks to a wider discourse of our times. Finally, I focused on the examples of the images we collect on our mobile phones and offer a method of exploring potential archival structures in this shared pool of data. Okay, I'm going to start the lecture now, and I hope you enjoy it. I'm unpacking my shopping, with apologies to Walter Benjamin, for whom the occasion of unpacking his books after 2 years in storage became an opportunity to reflect on the nature of collecting, collections, their relationship to memory, and their place in a dialogue with chaos. For Benjamin, each book as it emerges from the boxes is not primarily to be seen as reading material for the writer. On the contrary, he confesses at one stage in his collecting career, his ideal was a library of books that he has not read. Instead, each book is introduced as a key that unlocks the past to events surrounding its purchase and discovery, to the provenance it carries with it. Each book is a step on a journey through the collector's personal history and a location point in the void. The collector's passion, he writes, borders on the chaos of memories. The coordinates of that journey are given in the catalogue of the collection, while the experience of the journey into the past is found in handling and engaging with the books themselves. Surveying his unpacked collection, Benjamin is faced with, this is a quote, not thoughts but images, memories of the cities in which I found so many things, Riga, Naples, Munich, Danzig, Moscow, Florence, Basel, Paris, memories of Rosenthal's sumptuous rooms in Munich, of the Danziger Stockturm, where the late Hans Rauer was domiciled, of Sussenaut's musty bookseller in North Berlin, memories of the rooms where these books had been housed, of my student's den in Munich, of my room in Bern, of the solitude of Iseltwald, of the lake of Brienz, and finally of my boyhood room, the former location of only 4 or 5 of the several thousand volumes that are piled up around me. My shopping has come by delivery van, as has become my habit these days following acclimatization to the COVID-19 lockdown regulations. It arrives in trays, unbagged, so-called. And though there may be a logic to the way the trays have been loaded, it's not one that corresponds to my kitchen. Even so, I know what to do. Each item makes its way to a specific cupboard, shelf, or place in the fridge or freezer, according to type, and most either replacing a now depleted identical predecessor or standing in readiness next to it. By far the majority, then, belong to a group of my regular purchases, denoted as my favorites. In the world of online super shopping, my favorites exist as a subcategory within the vastly larger collection of goods available from the store. A table of hyperlinked images offers indexical information about my favorites when I log on to the supermarket website. Except that it's not just my favorites appearing on the screen. Snuck in at random points between the familiar items on the grid are some unexpected pretenders to the group. Evidently, the operational software has automatically searched for purchaser profiles similar to my own, finding products and produce within their favorites, which I might also be interested in. The strange thing is that until now, not one of those suggestions has felt in the least bit appropriate to me. This relatively small sample collection of my grocery purchases may not provide enough data to build a reliable consumer profile, and the supermarket would, after all, want to be offering me appropriate purchase options. But as the data set is extended to include other purchases, internet searches, journeys, places, vocabulary used in emails, choices of viewing, etc., what then? We are so used to constructing a linear narrative of ourselves based on recounting of event over time. What about this alternative model that represents our identities through the ever-growing collection of our recorded acts? As Christian Rudder has pointed out with considerable impact in his book Dataclysm, the data provided through an accumulation of our online choices when subjected to statistical analysis often reflect a different self back to us than the one that we thought we knew. While a linear explanation of ourselves may be characterized diagrammatically as a simple graph curve, like in this picture, charting event over time. And I apologize for the simplicity of the picture, but it's just to make this point. And then we do seem to give narratives about our life in this way and think about life having its ups and downs after all. But while we might express it like that, an alternative may in turn be modeled by a grid, like the grid on the right, that expands with event over the time. Each new square called up by a new event and containing a value that stands for that event. Narrative accounts of the subject person will be found in the example on the right in the patterns of similarity that emerge across the values. So you'd have event categories and start to group event categories, as in this diagram. In this case, these values are held digitally within a database, and patterns of similarity are discovered by algorithms. These are invariably a reflection of the search priorities of exterior agencies, whether those exterior agencies are advertising companies, government bodies, statistical analysis, and so on. The collection or data set of events is therefore subject to a process of classification and index that turn them into an archive of our lives with a multitude of intertwining narrative readings possible, presenting a complex and contradictory overall readings of the subject self. As we have seen with my shopping favorites example, these data sets intersect with other data sets, creating a general indexable archive of human behavior. This formulation corresponds with where the archive sits in Foucault's method as set out in the Archaeology of Knowledge. It's not the purpose of this talk to make an in-depth example of this here, but it is worth observing at this point the importance given in Foucault's schema to the indexical function that the archive plays across history between statements, otherwise acts, and discourse. In a 1966 interview on the archaeology of knowledge, Foucault states, "I mean by archive the set of discourses actually pronounced, and this set of discourses is envisaged not only as a set of events which would have taken place once and for all, and which would remain in abeyance in the limbo of purgatory of history, but also as a set that continues to function, to be transformed through history, and to provide the possibility of appearing in other discourses." This quote reveals the spatiality or even geography of Foucault's thought. It is as if the archive is a continuously evolving map of discourse, while the transformation of the archive is a function of the ongoing occurrence and changing interrelatedness of its constituent events. These events are points on the map, as I am imagining it, between which multiple, including contradictory, narratives may be traced. This is the architecture that the archive brings to the collection. It is one where narrative is multidirectional and sits in relation to event, as in a molecule, electrons bond atoms together. This dynamic relationship between event and narrative, characteristic of the collection, has much to offer in a re-examination of traditional narrative forms. An example I would like to highlight as particularly pertinent to the discussion here is Leanne Shapton's experimental novel titled Important Artifacts and Personal Property from the collection of Leonora Doolan and Harold Morris, including books, street fashion, and jewelry, published in 2009. It is presented as an auction catalogue of items put on sale by a couple, Leonora and Harold, otherwise known as How, who have decided to separate. The reader is invited to leaf through the items and the notes attached to each, to piece together an understanding of what the couple experienced during the 4 years of their romance. And it is important to put it this way: the point of the book is less about what happened and more an invitation to dwell forensically back and forth over the territory of their relationship, using the clues and objects left behind. And here's an example of just one of the pages in the book. And more examples can be found on Leanne Shapton's own website. We can surely see parallels in this connection of everyday objects with the odds and ends that mark out the path of our own lives. We recognize that the Leonora and Hal story is a fiction. The collection of ephemera it is built from, however, is not. Its existence creates the fiction. As with Benjamin's example of the library catalogue, the lot items in the sale catalogue are the coordinates of that history, as the stuff in our life, in our drawers, our cupboards, on our notice boards, could be lots in a catalogue of ours. Turning from fictional collectors, or not, depending on who you think the collector was here, it's important to rejoin Benjamin by looking in more detail at the persona of the collector. At the start of his talk, Benjamin introduces himself as a genuine collector and establishes that, as such, a talk about the collection will be a talk about himself. This is his justification for allowing the trawl through his books as they come out of the packing cases to be a tour of his memories and their associations. There are parallels here with the British architect Sir John Soane, 1753 to 1837, and pictured here much later in his life, who built a vast and eclectic private collection which he increasingly made more available for public purposes during his lifetime. Initially, this collection was for teaching his students, but eventually it was left to the nation in an endowment, which at the same time disinherited his son. Arguably, with Soane, an even more explicit case can be made for mapping the configuration of the collection onto the psychological history of the man. Even more explicit case than the one Benjamin's making, if you can be more explicit. This case includes, among many other factors, Soane's painful relationship with his son. The collection is still now situated in Soane's final home, which he had extensively converted to contain it, and remains by order of the bequest, much in the same sequence of the presentation as he left it him. And the home is in Lincoln's Inn Fields in London, Holborn, London. The sequence of presentation he left it in is neither chronological nor thematic, but based on a much less definable logic emerging from his own personal and psychological hinterland. In his 2010 lecture, Sir John Soane, Architecture, Collecting, and the Museum of Museums, at Magazine 3, Stockholm's Museum of Contemporary Art, former curator of the John Soane Museum, Georgi Kirkuk-Belinsky, gives a detailed account of how this hinterland, how Soane's own psychological hinterland, shapes the collection. As the museum is, by Soane's stipulation, so Soane stipulated the museum should be this way, it is without a guide, and its exhibits are without labels. These connections, then, are as much for the visitor to decipher, but we learn from Kirkuk-Belinsky that, among other things, Soane had an imaginary alter ego. So the visitor is invited into the museum and invited to work things out about Soane. But this lecture of Kirkuk-Belinsky gives us some clues, and one of them is that Soane had an imaginary alter ego, Padre Giovanni, a medieval monk, to whom a section of the museum is dedicated, and that he, Soane, also we learn from Kirkuk-Belinsky that he, Soane, buried his dog, which is also the subject of some other sentimental exhibits. His dog was called Fanny. He buried his dog in a mausoleum of Soane's own design, in an area which was clearly presented as if intended for the monk. On top of Kirkuk-Belinsky's explanation, we also have a text that Soane wrote in his lifetime, but which remained unpublished until recently. This text, titled Crude Hints Towards an History of My House in Lincoln's Inn Fields, it was only published in 2015, but written, as I say, towards the end of Soane's life. This text gives further indication as to how Soane wished the visitor to engage with his collection. This obscure tract imagines this house, and by extension the museum, as a future ruin, with Soane taking the character of an antiquary, an antiquary, picking his way through the ruin, while visitors speculate on the building's origins and functions. Benjamin's statement, "The collector's passion borders on the chaos of memories," never seemed truer than in the example of John Soane. What Benjamin calls the dialectical tension between the poles of disorder and order in the collection is where the collector is fated to operate. And likewise, the collection itself straddles those extremes. It emerges from the chaos of our lives, but provides the coordinates for mapping it out. In reflecting on this, all of this, in class with students, the question about us as collectors, both inadvertent and intentional, came into discussion. Thinking about the chaotic collections we are building up around us through our embodied and virtual lives, as they leave equally tangible and digital traces. Where among this growing accumulation of things are the markers for us? Granted, our digitized acts, purchases, journeys, internet searches, etc., feed into external profiling algorithms to build, for example, personalized commercial identities. But does this sufficiently reflect the complexity of our individual and shared experience? Among all the accumulation, something we all had in common was an attachment to the collections of photographs on our mobile phones. These had a strongly personal character, tied to experiences we valued, things we had seen, food we had cooked or had served to us, friends, pets, cherished places, funny stuff, sad stuff, stupid stuff, just stuff. This attachment, after all, drives much of social media, as the success of platforms that are primarily work with phone images has shown. Here it is possible to see an expansive, continuously developing archive of human experience. In some cases, as in Instagram, for example, thematically interactive through the use of hashtags. To further explore the potential of these collections of images, we adapted a methodology I had devised with my then colleague, Dr. Mattia Paganelli, for an earlier workshop on collections, which was held at the University of Greenwich in 2011, and which borrows from the structure inherent to the game of dominoes. Here's a picture of the game of dominoes, in case you don't know what I mean by that. In the case of the game that we invented, we also required tiles. The tiles were divided into two, but with photos on either side instead of dots. Sometimes these photos would share a thematic bond, sometimes not, as with domino tiles. Strict rules weren't applied to the playing of the game, other than to ask the players to apply the logic of dominoes to the placing of tiles. The range of options for this game were as follows. Groups can either agree to play one after each other, each with their own tiles, or they can keep their own tiles and play them when they think it's most effective. Or they can put all the tiles into a big pool and work together as a group to discuss where each tile should go. Also, then the second set of rules would be connected to the connections made from one tile to the next. And in this case, we kind of discuss whether the connections can be literal. So, for example, you have a portrait in one, so that means a portrait in the one next to it. They can be thematic, so they can be related as the squirrel is to a fox. In my example here, they can be associative, so they have a more narrative connection. So you see a picture of a drink and you see a picture of a straw. They have compositional connection. That's harder to represent with words, as I've done here, diagonal to diagonal, but I think you probably know what I mean. And also a tonal connection. So the colors or the tones of the colors match. And then the last set of rules obviously have to do with the direction of the tile. Should it go in the same direction? Should it carry straight on, or should it go at an angle? Should it fall between the two previous tiles? And for that, it was decided that we could use aspects of the decisions we made for A and B to help us with that. And for example, thematic and associative connections could go straight on, where compositional and tonal ones could take right angles, as an example. The important thing is that is that the rules aren't imposed by me or by anyone leading this workshop, because it's important that agreeing the rules is the point, because they set up the algorithm that will decide the final internal structure of the collection. Playing the game demonstrates a number of potential architectures for the pooled collections of these personal photographs, such as, and I've got an example here of a final game, such as thematic clusters, linear narratives, loops, some of which you can see here. You can see all these things here, cross-references and so on. It is interesting, and what's also interesting is if you have a number of groups playing the game at the same time and the different shapes that emerge as a result of that. It is interesting also to consider the impact of the random element that is invariably introduced by the second photograph on the tile, often throwing a spanner in the works. The second image prompts creative responses to assert a structural order within the assembled collection again. The final result presents a prototype pattern of an indexed archival structure for the subject pool of images, discovering sometimes surprising affinities across the group. As such, it is instructive of an inherent pull towards order in the polar dialectic between order and disorder of the collection. And it's fun to play. I recommend it. You will never look at archives in the same way again. Thank you.